Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a special webinar from Horizon Investments, and we're gonna try to keep this concise, but we're going to talk about gaining clarity amid the coronavirus confusion. With us, our panel of experts, it's myself, Robbie Cannon, Chief Executive Officer of Horizon. I have with me Scott Ladner, our Chief Investment Officer, as well as John Drazel, our Head of Distribution. But I'm excited to have Dr. Sepe join us as well. You know, as we talk about the coronavirus, there's so much speculation, and there's so in all of the speculation, especially with the speed of the media, it's necessary to have a technical expertise, and there's really a lacking of that expertise as you listen to the media. So we thought it was really important to do a couple things here in regards to this webinar: is separate the problem of the virus from the problem of the conversation of the virus. And so for that, we brought in Dr. Stephen Sepe, and I'm going to let you see the substance of his background in terms of the positions that he's held. But he's a distinguished immunologist and infectious disease specialist, and he consults with organizations worldwide on clinical development and biopharma medical affairs. We're really excited to have Dr. Sepe. He's been gracious to spend time with us yesterday and then on Friday. And we thought it'd be really helpful from a substance standpoint to just get into his expertise as it relates to his early days as a clinician fighting what you know as the HIV virus. So Dr. Sepe, if you could give us a little perspective on that fight, and then we'll transition into the coronavirus.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to meet everyone, and I appreciate the privilege of being able to talk with you today. And obviously a very contemporaneous topic of interest globally. And it's always fun in some respects and informative in others as we all self-reflect on our experiences in managing such problems. For myself, it's back to my early days, many years ago, the very first start of the HIV epidemic. I was a fellow at Boston University School of Medicine and the NIH, and seeing patients at Boston City Hospital, and we had started seeing some of the very first patients who ultimately were found to have HIV. Of course, this was a very significant development, very novel, in many ways challenging, and rapidly evolving over now, 40 years or so. So those experiences stick with me as indelible in my mind as if they happened 5 minutes ago. Very difficult to forget the issues at hand, the pictures of patients and people coming in with the problem, and we learned an awful lot. And I fully believe, and I know my colleagues would concur, that a lot of the evolution of that disease over these many years, both its recognition, identification, treatment, and ultimate natural history, is something we can call on in future or contemporaneous problems such as we're experiencing today with coronavirus. So it's with some of that experience and also with some of the other outbreaks with SARS and MERS in the 2000s or so, that I think we can have a good conversation today based on what was outlined here. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great, and thanks, Dr. Sepe, again. Hey, this is Scott Ladner, everybody, and we just prepared a couple of broad questions which are really on many people's minds right now, and so Dr. Sepe, I just want to kind of dive in and just start and say, what should we expect to see in the weeks ahead? Like how these things progress, how they develop, what kind of news flow and what kind of headlines and what kind of information should we expect to see over the coming weeks in your opinion?
Well, I think it would broadly be divided or defined by a couple or three areas, and one would be how is this virus spreading? This is almost always the first thing that's discussed on various broadcasts, whether expert or scientific websites, seminars, and so forth. And that's a crucial element of what's happening. You've heard the word pandemic used often, and this is something that requires knowing how the virus is spread and its mode of transmission and the extent, severity of the transmission that helps us define whether it truly is worldwide and global, which is one of the criteria. So we'll hear certainly more of that. Number two, there is literally a day-to-day discussion of new cases. These are important to hear about because each case it can present in and of itself new presentations, new findings, insights into the virus and its clinical presentations that are very, very helpful moving forward. And you'll hear a lot about that. And this is a topic that's very important in many, many ways. And to me, important in knowing how to filter what you hear, because of much of what you hear is not only incorrect, but much of it is, some of it is hyperbolic, and we have to be careful in knowing what to filter. And then thirdly, of course, the areas of most perhaps dramatic interest is what's the prospect of being able to arrest this virus from spreading? Number two, do we have any candidates or ideas or concepts on how to treat it, either interventional treatment such as biologics or pharmaceutics? And then thirdly, of course, what's widely discussed as vaccine development. And I might add that these topics have been discussed, in my opinion, by Dr. Fauci in very great detail. I think he's done a terrific job in communicating factual information and a very tempered way and guidance as to how we should be responding or reacting to the situation.
No, that's super helpful. What do we think? It seems Dr. Sepe, that things are they change minute by minute and day by day on this. What, in your opinion, are some of the more important changes that you've identified and that you're watching over these last few days?
A couple of key areas here. First, since we spoke just a few days ago, we have 3 cases in Rhode Island, and those are new, and they're identified. This was related to a school trip to one of the outbreak areas in Italy, and each of these individuals was not symptomatic when they left, but upon arrival became sick and are now being quarantined. This is how fast this information literally is developing or evolving. But each of these cases gives us some information that we have to be very diligent and incisive about in terms of the scientific information that's being forwarded, but also what is it telling us about how the virus is behaving or conducting in the various communities. In that regard, what's changed is that over the last week, there have been many cases now of what we would identify as community or communicable cases. That is, that there was no recognized former exposure or defined exposure, and obviously spread from person to person, likely, and from an asymptomatic index person with the infection. This is key to know whether this virus is actually being experienced in many more people than we might anticipate or know about right now, but their own immune systems are capable of responding to the virus, and these patients or individuals may in fact be recovering. We don't know that yet. That's a crucial.
Yeah, could you dive in a little bit more into that, like in terms of like why that matters or in one way or the other?
Yeah, because right now we're hearing case fatality rates, right? And this is something that's updated every day. Case fatality rate is the death rate per case of symptomatic patients. And that case rate is estimated to be right now about 1%. I've heard it as high as 2%, but that about 1% seems right. But that depends on how we define the population being measured. Right now, we're talking about cases that have been clinically identified and I also confirmed with sophisticated tests that have been developed by CDC and distributed worldwide. Well, how do we get at the fact or the concept that there may be individuals who in fact have been exposed and their body has been infected with the virus, but they have as yet not developed symptoms, or perhaps they've had the virus and were able to eradicate it with their own immune systems? This is an area of particular interest to me because it's of extreme epidemiologic importance. Because if those patients exist, there are people who are not symptomatic, and that number happens to be large. Obviously, the denominator becomes larger. There may be more cases that we're currently able to identify. But also, because of that, the case rate goes down. The case rate is a measure for us is not only virulence, but lethality, right? So if you're going from 1 to 2% with the denominator of, let's say, by example, 100,000, of people who are symptomatic and confirmed, but there are really 1 million people who are infected, but the case rate, death rate is the same. Well, obviously the rate of death goes down. This is something CDC, pardon me, and the panel of experts that the administration has gathered, which is the best in the world, have looked at very carefully. There's efforts going on to test these various populations in different ways in the epicenter areas, but also here in the United States. That's going to be important for us to find out. We have the testing kits available. CDC developed them and distributed them. So I would expect within the next several weeks, we start getting this information start coming in, and we can start getting much more close and accurate projections of the scope and scale of the infection. And that helps us. It gives us a sense of the pace of spread and the amount of time, to treatment that we always want to shorten. Those are key elements in the development of an intervention.
That's super helpful. And so
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So that actually goes right into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is one of the things I found is really helpful when we chatted on Friday and again yesterday. Was this idea that, there's a lot of good and a lot of bad data sources out there. There's a lot of good and a lot of bad websites out there. And you were, I thought it was really helpful when you were kind of went through what you believe to be the really kind of the websites you should look at for good data, for responsible information. And then within those websites, the kinds of data that you actually can go and find. And so I was hoping you'd be able to share with our listeners a little bit about, what are the websites that you go to when, as an expert to go and find the data that you use to analyze and form your conclusions? And then what are, you spoke a little bit about this sort of the denominator in the fatality equation, where in those websites, there's a lot of information. Where should people go to try to understand really what's going on and where are the experts looking for the data that they're using to come up with their conclusions?
There's several good ones I really want to stress and hope that everybody takes a peek at these. First, good place to start is the CDC website itself, cdc.gov. You can just Google in COVID-19 or COVID-2 or coronavirus infection. They'll come up. The CDC site will be there. CDC on a daily basis is updating, anywhere from 24 to 48 hours, several themes. Each one, presented in a convenient link. Go to those sites and start familiarizing yourself with some of the background information. Get a little sense of what it is about this virus that may be special or maybe not so special. Perhaps it's routine, and you'll see both of those discussed. And importantly, updates onto the rate of spread and the things we've just talked about. So cdc.gov is a very good one. What I look at in particular, there's a site that you just link to. It has literally a global map. It's a bubble map, and it reports the latest prevalence, or more accurately, incidence, numbers of new cases worldwide. And it's very instructive because you see a visual. Because it's color coded, you can see this visual changing day to day. The bubble's getting bigger or smaller. And I might parenthetically add an important point. It should be noted that we're already seeing thousands of patients from the Wuhan epicenter that appear to be recovering or are recovering clinically. And this is important. We have several cases in the United States of people who are recovering under quarantine. So we know there's a recovery rate. We know there's an adequate immune response out there, and it's responding that way in a stereotypic way that viruses tend to behave. So on to other websites. A very, very good one is the NIH website. It's a bit more academic, but there's different bits of perspective there. And you might look at the NIAID, which is the National Infectious Disease and Allergy Division, and go right to what you want to learn about how the virus is spreading. And usually there's expert opinions there from Dr. Fauci and the team. This is good because I think Dr. Fauci is truly a renowned viral expert. He was, not to overuse the word, but at the epicenter of the HIV epidemic, and has a very measured approach, carefully describes in a very vigilant way what we're seeing in a scientific basis that's simple to understand for the general public, and also what's happening and what do we hope to see and what are we trying to accomplish. So NIH is a good site. There's something I mentioned the other day, a little bit more technical, but it reads like a newsletter. It's called MMWR, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. This is CDC's literal blow-by-blow what's happening in any area of outbreak, and you can break that down. You'll see how the data is arrayed. That's a site I use often, and it just gives you a quick visual insight as to how the epidemiology may be changing. In addition, one of the major medical journals has its own issues of how it orients its medical information, but I think the New England Journal of Medicine has been doing a good job keeping up with their newsletters, and that's a good source. And then lastly, I always look at the WHO, the World Health Organization. I have issues with the World Health Organization. I do think, and it's my own personal, take it as an editorial comment, I think there's some political or geopolitical perspectives that seem to be injected sometimes. But what you can glean from the head of WHO are the respective responses in each of the countries. That's important because it's sort of like, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So as well as we're doing here, we're doing exceptionally well in the United States. If China and now Iran has been reporting, Iran in particular is ill-prepared, we think, to manage numbers of cases. Well, that then becomes a new, as we call a secondary epicenter, so to speak, in an area where the virus can spread more rapidly. So there's different perspectives among those 4 or 5 websites. Those are the ones I look to. There's one last one that is almost purely scientific or academic, but may be of interest to you and what your work is, and that's clinicaltrials.gov. This is an FDA, and there's other sponsored institutions there that simply list, in many respects, for active trials, clinical trials, in great detail, what the trials involve, what the methodology is, and you may be seeing these, and in fact there are some out there already, about trial designs meant to look at the coronavirus problem. That's where you may see for the first time how United States and global biopharmas are responding in the biopharma biotechnical space to the outbreak and what they propose to be doing conceptually. For all those who are interested, it's scientifically oriented, obviously, but you'll get the details of and much more accurate information about what trials are actually happening. There's a lot of false information going on out there about what's being discovered and who's studying what. I and colleagues of my area are very sticky about the criteria of what constitutes a particular clinical trial and what the virtue of the data that's produced is. So criteria are important, how the patients that are being studied are described, the methods being used, the types of tests and test assays, are the kits, the availability, distribution chains and distribution and supply lines and so forth and so on, access to drug if it's a drug trial. You can find those sorts of things. That kind of detail usually is in there. So those would be the ones I put on the top of my list. And if you permit me,
that is sure.
Please don't include social media and some of the major networks. I have to tell you, even since the last time we spoke, I'm appalled at some of the things I've been seeing that are, to me, personally and professionally disturbing. There's a lot of hyperbole out there, this sense of, extreme urgency and danger. I think we all feel here, particularly in the United States, because our risk is still very, very low here. And we have to be measured, we have to think, we have to listen to what's being said and then filter it and recognize as best we can any biases that are being presented. And so far, I have to say, and I don't say this lightly or with any, enjoyment, the network reports have not been, in my opinion, up to snuff. So I'll leave that at that.
That is actually a perfect segue into this next question, which is, really like people on this call, by and large, get their information from the national media. I would venture to say there are not a whole lot of folks on the call that get the MMWR report. I do now, thanks to you. But there's a whole lot of it's difficult to get information on stuff like this, and so generally we do rely upon the national media, broadly speaking, to get us information. And so it sounds like hyperbole and kind of overstating some things is one thing that you think the media is not getting wrong. But are there other things that you think they're getting wrong, and what do you think they're getting right at the same time?
Well, I think a couple of things that I think they're getting wrong is not only the content is important, and we could challenge the content in a number of instances I've seen where the information being put out is just simply incorrect. A lot of information initially about what the virus was dealing with. This is not a brand new virus. We've been studying coronaviruses for 30 years, and it's a mutant. How it evolved is likely through animal spread, and those types of pieces of information were probably accurate, but we don't know for sure exactly what's happening with this virus that makes it spread in the way it does is what we're learning, and it's evolving on a day-to-day basis. But sometimes it's not only the content, it's the method and the demeanor in which it's presented, and I find this sometimes unbelievable. It's just over the edge. For example, I could say to you, today there were 3 new cases that were discovered in Rhode Island and identified and confirmed, but fortunately these patients are doing very, very well in the quarantine. They're not extremely ill. We expect them to do well and recover. Or I could say there were 3 new cases discovered in Rhode Island. This makes the total cases of unidentified community spread 42. This is an urgent situation and they're taking measures in Rhode Island. You see my point? Same information in terms of content is being communicated, but this sense of urgency and sometimes even the look on the faces of the reporters, I mean, give me a break. The other part is notice the background, the pictures they're showing. It has nothing to do with Rhode Island. They're showing people in ICUs in China. So, in oxygen sacks with masks on and, NASMET garb. And this creates very, very, I think, urgent and desperate images in people. When you just see that image, you can picture yourself in that bag. This is not good, and I think it's doing a disservice. So panic is not good. Over-reporting or theatrics doesn't help. I wish, and that's why I don't watch it anymore. Just tune in to the websites. There are often, you can stream some active seminars that are being put out now all over the place. Try to stick to academic institutions, and this is my critique of the media in terms of what I think is wrong. Relax, give a measured reassurance. We will get a hold and control of this virus. It will likely have some scientific, credible information, statistically valid information being generated over the next several months that we can use and utilize for the development of treatments. So that's kind of a message. What they got right is the fact that they're reporting anything at all. It just strikes me, this is another thing that just, they're driving me crazy, because if there's any silver lining out of this whole experience, it's that when all the dust settles and we finally find out what the actual prevalence, that is the number of people who harbor the virus, is, that denominator, the mysterious denominator I was talking about, which we can test for and we'll find it out. Once we know that, it may very well be that this particular coronavirus is not much more lethal than its cousin, cold viruses. So, but the side value, the off-target benefit, will be that everything that's being said about coronavirus prevention, excellent and thorough hand washing. By the way, I can't help but say this: when you're washing your hands, sing happy birthday, all right? So that takes 24 seconds to sing usually, and you got to wash your hands for 20 seconds or more, or else, a trickle under the faucet doesn't work, right? So, but, the idea is that the preventive measures, even some would say the interventional measures, the methods and modes used to stall or shorten or slow the spread of the virus, are exactly the same for the influenza virus. And you've heard nothing about the influenza endemics. I mean, there's been a flu outbreak here in Rhode Island. It wasn't covered adequately by the vaccine and so forth. This is experience that we're seeing. There's tens of thousands of case fatalities from influenza already, and nobody ever reports that. 18 million cases in the first several months, and there's upwards, probably at this point, I haven't looked today, but 30 or 40 million cases of flu. And overall, we'll probably see this year somewhere between 50 and 100,000 deaths, and there can be many more. So why the theatrics about the coronavirus? Yes, it may be new to some, as it's reported that way, but not the very helpful public health information about influenza. And the same messages would hold for both. So that's kind of where I'm standing on the media and what they're getting wrong and right. And I think it would be fascinating once a year from now we know what the data looks like. It wouldn't surprise me totally if we see a little flattening in the curve of influenza cases, simply because more people have been taking appropriate preventative measures, hand washing, and so forth. Lack of direct contact, self-quarantine is needed, and that I wouldn't be surprised if we see that the number of flu cases may be down a little bit, or a little bit flat curve this year. But we'll see what that looks like next year. But I hope I made my point there, that there are things we can learn from this that are very important.
Dr. Sepe, it's John Drozel. Thanks again for joining us. This has been really, really helpful, very productive conversation. I'm sure all of the participants of the webinar are really as grateful as we are for you to be on this call with us. So thank you so much for your time. You've been super gracious to us, and we're grateful for that. What I'd like to do now is to turn this over to Scott. Scott, we got a lot of great information on this call.
Yes, we did.
And we've had quite a day in the market. So we had a 50 basis point emergency rate cut. I'm curious how you think that comports with the conversation we just had.
Well, I mean, look, the Fed obviously can't cure a virus, but they can help an economy, and they clearly see some threat from decreased activity, and so they're moving, and the fact that they're moving in the way that they moved is actually pretty interesting. It's the first real live test case we've got of them using their new kind of this new framework that they have for monetary policy, which is essentially means if we have low rates to start with, if we're going to do anything monetarily, we need to act preemptively, and we need to go in with a bazooka. And this is the first time we've actually seen them do that since they finished their policy review a couple of months ago. So it's sort of fascinating. The market's reaction is frankly all over the place, and liquidity is all over the place as well. But one thing that has happened is bond yields are down substantially. That is going to be a tailwind to economic activity. And it's also, we should keep in mind, just one simple way of kind of asset replacement. Look at the dividend yield in the S&P 500 relative to the 30-year bond yield. You can get 2.25% dividend yield out of the S&P 500, and the 30-year bond yield is 1.5% right now. So just in terms of what do you want to learn, what do you want to own for the next 30 years? A treasury that yields 1.5%, or the U.S. stock market for the next 30 years. It's those types of substitution effects are what they're aiming for with this, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few months. The other thing that that I think is underreported. We spent this entire call, appropriately so, because we have an absolute expert available to us, which we're so thankful for again. But we've spent the entirety of this call talking about the coronavirus and its impact on things. And one thing that I think has been completely underreported, and has mattered far more than what people think, is the political situation. I don't think that it's a coincidence that the market fell out of bed and suddenly started to care about coronavirus the day after Sanders jumped to victory in Nevada last Monday, a week ago Monday. There was certainly something having to do with the coronavirus with that market action, but there's no way you can discount the fact that Sanders just absolutely looked like he was running away with things, and what that would do to the political situation here in this country and market situation here in this country. So the fact that Biden responded in South Carolina this past weekend, and we're obviously on Super Tuesday today, so we'll see. We will know a lot more tomorrow and in the coming days. But this idea of a contested convention on the Democratic side is actually getting far more likely, especially if things play out the way that 438 at least predicts right now, because the amount of delegates that any remaining candidate is going to need to get is likely going to be too high of a hurdle. But talk about 60+% of the remaining delegates after Super Tuesday for either one of these guys to get. That's just going to be tough to do. One last thing I would say, and Dr. Sepe referred to this idea that things in the Wuhan region are the epicenter of the coronavirus. Look like they're getting better from a kind of a scientific and from a health standpoint. We're also seeing some pretty interesting activity. If you look at satellite images coming out of China, port activity is actually firmed sharply. So we saw port activity, for instance, in the port of Shanghai, which is the busiest port in the world. Port activity just went to zero. I mean, it collapsed. So China really did experience a very material slowdown in their economic activity. Well, if you look at satellite imagery and do the big data analysis associated with that, it's going to tell you that really over the last 1 to 2 days, that port activity, the port of Shanghai, is within earshot of normal levels again. So China, the epicenter where this thing all started, looks like the turnaround from when it peaked in terms of caseload to when economic activity is beginning to come back to normal, somewhere around 3 to 4 weeks. That's really fast. That's sort of encouragingly fast in terms of return to normal economic activity. But that does give us at least some glimpse as to what the timeline may look like for a resumption of activity once cases finally do peak. So those are really sort of our thoughts on what's going on right now. But it is a fascinating times we live in, and we're assimilating as much information as we possibly can right now. And we will be in close contact and be as communicative as we have been over the past week. We will continue to push information out your way, and we will continue to answer any and all questions you might have for us about either markets or portfolios that you've entrusted us with. So we appreciate your time today, and turn it back over to Robbie.
Yeah.
Or John.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining us. Look, we will stay in constant communication with you, and we will bring more information as it becomes available. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.